All right, we're back for the Hoover Library Sci-Fi Festival, Sci-Fi Fantasy Festival. This is a panel on independent comics, basically the comic books that are not the big two comic books. I'm Stan Daniel with Albert Marsh from Kingdom Casts. Joining us is Mr. Robert Clow. Robert, tell us a little bit about yourself, sir.
Hey guys, so I'm a critic. I've been doing criticism for almost 20 years now, mostly of independent, alternative, underground comics, including things like mini comics, zines. So from the tiniest, humblest self-published comics to often graphic novels put out by big name publishers like Random House. It's a wide variety of things. I write for my own blog is called High Low Comics. I've written for the Comics Journal, SecArt. Currently, I'm part of a new project called SolRad, SOLRAD.co. And part of that, we have a podcast called Enemies of the State, which is done through there. And we're very excited about SolRad because we're actually, one of our goals is to both publish comics as well as publish criticism.
Awesome. Very nice. Very nice. Well, you're actually, and I said this shortly before we started the podcast, you're actually down into the nitty gritty of it with the zines and such. Usually Albert and I, when we're doing an independent comic, we consider, we'll take anybody that's not the big two as the independents, the stuff that get overlooked. And that way back when, that used to even include The Walking Dead, even though that doesn't even remotely seem like it's independent. But things from Image and all. Tell us, what out there has, like, since the quarantine began, what's grabbed your interest out there? What should people be on the lookout for?
Gosh, the thing that's interesting about the independent scene is that there's really something for every kind of reader. And that's something that you really couldn't say about comics 20 years ago, maybe even 10. From like stuff for kids, for example, the best-selling comics in the world currently are a series called Dogman.
Yeah.
By Dav Pilkey. And it's my 11-year-old loves them, and all kids, male and female, love them. Can't get enough of this incredibly stupid yet fun idea of a dog and a cop who get in an accident, and they're fused together, and now it's Dogman as his cop, and he weaves in all these, like, you know, literary allusions into it as well, in the stupidest way possible. Similarly, most comic companies didn't aim anything at girls for a long time, which used to be true in the industry, because in the 30s, 40s, the 50s, boys and girls read comics interchangeably, and there were comics aimed at them, and then at a certain point, it just kind of got winnowed down to superheroes for a variety of reasons. But now people are realizing, oh yeah, girls usually like to read more than boys generally, and girls love comics. So there's just a variety of the most popular author who aims their stuff mostly at girls, but also a wider audience. Her name is Raina Telgemeier. She had a book called Smile, and some of their books are autobiographical and some of them are fictional, but they all have a very pleasing, fluid style.
Yeah.
The other thing is that what a lot of people don't know about companies like Fantagraphics, Fantagraphics has kind of like been the flagship company of alternative comics for, you know, nearly 40 years. And people like to associate them with sort of like, you know, literary comics, but if that's not your bag, they publish a lot of stuff that isn't that, some of which are either reprints or bringing it to English the first time, really cool genre work from like South American artists and European artists, like Alberto Breccia is one of them, and he has put out a book called Paramus, which is just bonkers. But they're also doing all these reprints of EC comics in
Oh
really
yeah,
interesting ways. And they're doing reprints of all of the Carl Barks Donald Duck comics.
they were putting out very nice hardcovers of the EC stuff and the Carl Barks stuff. Carl Barks stuff seemed a little more intermittent, but they were continually putting out the EC stuff. But I'd imagine that they've got a lot more material to pull from with EC.
Yeah, and plus the Mickey Mouse comics by Floyd Gottfredson, which are incredible adventure comics. And you look at a guy like Jeff Smith,
Bone.
Bone, and if you read Carl Barks for like 10 minutes, you realize, oh, I see where Jeff Smith basically got,
Oh yeah.
most of his inspiration. And the volume of comics, honestly, right now in the world, but even now in the alternative world, is so great that it's impossible to keep up.
Yeah, the floodgates are wide open to it. Let me ask you this, jumping back to Dogman real quick, because Albert in the podcast has brought up Dogman before. And we did kind of hit a little bit of, I had a question about it, and we think he is the creator of Dogman, is this the same guy as Captain Underpants?
It sure is.
That's okay. Yeah,
Struck gold twice.
Yeah. Well, Captain Underpants was an outstanding, I mean, he had his time in the spotlight. If it hasn't gone down any around that, he used to be one of the better selling off the shelf serial books.
They still do well, but Dogman is another level.
Yeah.
And on the day he decides to turn that into an animated series or a movie, it's going to be ridiculous.
Oh, look, an ongoing streaming with all the streaming options now and everything. Both Captain Underpants and that's prime targets. Targets for.
As kind of an aside, it's weird. It's not weird to us now to see Marvel and DC superhero movies and cartoons. Although for so long that was such a difficult thing. When I was growing up, I watched like the kind of mediocre Spider-Man live action show and just watching and thinking, this isn't what I want it to be. It's all I kind of had, but it's like, I wish that it was better.
Are you talking about the CBS one from the 1970s with Larry
Nicholas
Tate?
Cannon.
Yeah, Nicholas Cannon. Larry Tate from Bewitched as J. Jonah Jameson.
Right.
Yeah.
And now kids, I mean, the wealth of fantasy superhero fiction now is just absurd. But it's funny that in seeking out content and streaming providers, everybody's just so desperate for content and looking for content. A lot of alternative comics and underground comics have been turned into Netflix series.
Oh yeah.
For example, Netflix has a series called The End of the Fucking World. That was originally started as a $1 mini comic by Chuck Forsman that he would sell. Each issue was 8 pages. Eventually, it was collected, and then it was adapted from the collection. But it had like the humblest of roots. Another one called Daybreak, which is a zombie one, was based on this zombie independent comic by a guy named Brian Ralph, who was part of a movement in the late 90s, early 2000s that took things like monsters and robots and drew them in this really kind of almost naive way and packed, and they're really densely packed. It was the opposite of like reading a superhero comic that's like fluid. It's like challenged the reader to like to penetrate what was going on. And that was turned into a series. And then of course, a guy named Luke Pearson did a series of books with a character named Hilda. And those have been on Netflix. That was a Netflix series. It was super successful. And that's another great kids series. That's an adventure series that I would recommend heartily to any adult.
Well, it's all crossing genres. Like we had mentioned before we started recording and all that. We live in an age where we've got the best possible representation of Captain America, Iron Man, Thor in the movie theaters. You know, people like me, you and Albert, we never really thought we'd see that. We thought, you know, we may have been hitting the pinnacle with that first X-Men there. And you look
Right.
back at it and it's got its moments. But
I remember watching that 20 years ago and
yeah,
thinking, this is the first time they've got it more or less right.
yeah, they came close to it. You see, Blade came before it. And
Right.
when I saw Blade, I thought, well, they're still off a bit with the character's powers and abilities, but you know, at least somebody's paying attention. And then you got the X-Men, and just ecstatic to even hear the names Wolverine, Storm, Cyclops mentioned on screen. But nowadays, everything that's out there that gets any sort of attention, like Umbrella Academy from Image Comics, isn't that Albert in that Gerard Way on Umbrella Academy, or am I thinking?
No, that's is it, he,
Isn't it the
lead singer.
twins?
Yeah,
Yes,
it's the lead singer of
Smashing Pumpkins.
no.
No. It is Gerard Way. He's
It's
of My
Gerard
Chemical
Way?
Romance.
Yeah,
Chemical Romance. Okay, I did
it's his version of Morrison's Doom Patrol is what that is.
the Umbrella Academy.
Yeah.
They snatched it right up. They put it on. Yeah, they put that on television when that book first came out. It just didn't look like a workable property. Didn't look like it'd be able to make the leap into it as well. The one you mentioned, Robert. Oh dear Lord, it was the first one you mentioned with something. My Life
And in the world?
may have been it. Female superhero is
no.
okay. No, then I'm getting this confused.
And the world's about these two teenagers who like run away from home.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, we were rating that. We reviewed that on the podcast.
And then Chuck also did one called I Am Not Okay With This.
Yes.
Again, which started as a $1 mini comic. And that's actually more fantasy oriented because it's about a girl who's kind of like not treated very well, and she has these incredibly powerful psychic abilities that can kill people.
It's the girl from It that they hired to play the girl, and it's on Netflix too. Or if it isn't on Netflix currently, it's about to be. So yeah, that was the one I'm not okay with this. And I knew is there a connection between the two of those?
There's not, other than Chuck Forsman is the creator of both.
Well, okay, that's it. We reviewed the first one came out. I found that to be very interesting. I thought it was a pretty good book. It was very entertaining. I wasn't big on the art, but I liked the rest of it. I had never heard of I'm Not Okay With This until Netflix had turned it into a series. I had somehow completely and totally missed this. Let me ask you this. One of our favorites right now is written by Simon Spurrier, and it's called Alienated. Have you picked that up at all?
No, I've heard of him, and I've heard of that series. Tell me about it.
Albert, give him the layout.
Well, what it is, it's about these three teenagers, and they come across this alien, and this alien sort of attaches himself to all three of them. But at the same time, it ends up killing a fourth kid. But it's mostly like the way the alien, like all three of the kids are connected, but it also gives the kids like stupidly strong powers. Like one of them was like, my parent abandoned me, so he uses the alien to sort of like do like a psychic connection to that person and just like lets them have it. And right now, because it's early in the series, they're sort of doing that with each of the kids, but they still have things like, well, there's a kid that's missing. The kid's dead based on what we know, because the alien ripped him apart to nothing. But there's still a missing kid out there. There's obviously going to be problems with the three kids because they're all connected, and they can all see what each of them does when they don't want to and stuff like that. It's a very, very good book.
It's a very human element to it, Robert. It's you want to look and you want to, comic books, superhero comics especially, You want to be able to clearly define the good guy, the bad guy most of the time when you sit down to read something like this. And there's not. You look at the situation and the circumstances and you feel for each of these characters. The alien is really not like your typical alien. He's not like E.T. and he's walked on to this. He comes on as an infant. He attaches himself to the three in different ways, and they utilize him. They let their emotions get the better of them. It's an extraordinary book. I wouldn't be at all surprised if it went up for an Eisner or a couple of Eisners. The character design in it's brilliant as well. And also, I highly recommend checking that out.
That sounds great. And I was actually an Eisner judge a few years back.
Awesome.
And that experience was interesting. It's like how books get picked out. And books that tend to get very well reviewed always get pushed. It's like, say, hey, you need to read this because it's on a list. Because there's so much material and so little time and so many categories. There's like 30 categories. There's some winnowing done, but like the opinions of critics actually have a lot of weight in what gets selected to be looked at first.
When you explain go into that being a judge for the Eisners a little bit, when there's multiple categories, there's multiple aspects to it. How is superhero comics looked in general? How are the big two looked at in general when something comes forward? Do you feel is it a obligated thing, or is it just based on merit, or?
It's based on merit and experience, and the way that the judges are chosen is as follows. They're they fill categories. So one of the judges is a critic. One of the judges is an academic. One of the judges is a store owner. One of the judges is a creator. And then one of the judges is someone connected to Comic-Con in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And their role is more or less the role of the fan. So depending on who is in each of those categories has some influence on what's chosen. My experience most years is that it tends to skew a little more mainstream. It's what I refer to the big two or superhero comics in general, that most of the people there are more familiar with those kinds of comics. And surprisingly, that's especially true of the academics. Most academics in comics are studying or doing mainstream work, which you wouldn't necessarily think that was true, but it is. And the pro can be someone who is, a longtime vet, someone new, and can be someone in mainstream, can be someone else. They try to balance. They do their best to balance, like in terms of gender and other things as well.
Who picks y'all?
I'm sorry. There's one other category I forgot. Librarian.
That makes sense. So
that's the sixth category. So there's 6 judges. Who picks us is Jackie Estrada is in charge of basically the Eisner Awards, and she chooses the judges, and is kind of I wouldn't say she's an unofficial judge herself, but she has some influence in like what's seen and what's not seen. And the way the process works is that a master list is created of these are the best reviewed comics of the year. And lists like that from like lots of different critics are often skewed away from the big two, towards more in like kind of what I would call like the middle category, like sort of Image, Dark Horse, those sort of things, and then a lot of alternative comics like Fantagraphics, Drawn and Quarterly, those kinds of companies as well, in terms of like who are the critics picking. So those books are all looked at. And the categories range. So there's categories that break down for individuals. Best writer, best penciler, best writer artist, best colorer, best letterer, goes on and on. And then it also breaks down into like types of books. So like best anthology series, best ongoing series, best reality-based graphic novel. So like autobiographical stuff versus best fictional graphic novel. And then there's like 3 categories for like young readers. There's several categories for international work, including one for manga, one for European comics. Awards for like best academic work, best book about comics, non-academic. So there's like I said, 30 categories if you've ever seen a list.
Yeah.
And the Eisners are actually this weekend, as it turns out. Anyway,
they're still doing like digital Comic-Con, like that's still they're still doing it. So I guess the Eisners, everyone's just sort of sitting in their houses or something.
Yeah, there's gonna be a big Zoom event, like everything else. The show that I work at, the Small Press Expo in Washington D.C., we're gonna do something similar. We have our own awards ceremony. Ours is called the Ignatz Awards, after Ignatz the mouse from Crazy Cat, the comic strip, the one who liked to throw bricks. So in lieu of giving like a trophy, we give every winner a brick.
Oh, now that's good.
Yeah, and they all
saves
have
a lot of money.
Well, we buy our bricks in bulk. And the only problem is when they try and get them through airport security, they usually have to ask some questions. But for the Eisners, every one of us would volunteer to be like the gatekeeper for like 2 or 3 categories. So like the things that you felt most comfortable with. So I took like best anthology, best reality-based work, and something else like that, like things I'm like an expert in. And it was the gatekeeper's job to like winnow it down. And then when you got there, and then you would just get these boxes of comics in the mail and just read as much as possible. And then when you got there, every moment was spent either winnowing a list down as much as possible and reading all day for like 4 days when you did the judging. And then included also doing the coming up with the Hall of Fame candidates, which was its own thing. So yeah, it was a process, and the way it is ensured fairness was when you were deciding to keep or not keep something, you gave it a 1 to 5 rating, 5 being this is outstanding and absolutely needs to be considered for awards consideration, till 1 being this is garbage,
Not even sure how it got in there.
Right. and sometimes you would have taste differences. And I'll tell you one thing, the most contentious category by far was best humor work. Because no TP have the same sense of humor, and that really plays out in something like this. And they're like, shouting arguments about that. But mostly we got along, and mostly we got it done pretty quickly. We basically were told, like, be careful when you're wielding those numbers, especially at 1.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're giving out 1s like left and right, they're like, you're clearly trying to like game the system.
Yeah.
So
to me, that'd be sort of obvious. Like, I like this one book. So this one book gets a 5, and there's other stuff that the stuff that, let's say, maybe could be competition with it. Oh, that's a 1. So
Exactly. So you're told,
No.
don't do that. Just be honest with how you felt about something.
We use a 1 to 5 rating system on Kingdom when we review the weekly books each week on Kingdom Cast's podcast. And I think, what was it? I gave a -4 to Death Metal number 2.
One thing I learned was I hadn't read a lot of mainstream books or Marvel DC books at that point for a while. So I read a bunch of them, and some of them were pretty good. Like I was reading Jason Aaron's Thor. That was quite entertaining.
Mm-hmm.
I read a lot of Jeff Lemire's superhero comics, and those are good.
Well, he does a lot of good, creator-owned stuff too. So
Yeah,
right. I was reading Black Mass. That was very entertaining.
That's a very good book.
Yeah. Well, Dead Rabbit, but they renamed it. Albert, Image Comics. Dead Eyes.
Yeah, Dead Eyes.
Yeah, Dead Eyes. Who did that?
I don't know, because that was one of the ones I was trying to look up for our list and couldn't remember the name of it because we had too much gap and nothing, and my mind went blank in those.
Well, for some reason, I thought it was Lemire or Lemire. No. So, but that by itself, the process of the Eisners and all, dear Lord, we'd love to have you on the podcast sometime just to talk about that.
Sure.
And that just sounds extraordinary. What have you seen coming down the pike that people should keep their eyes out for?
Oh, geez. One of the very best books of the last few months is a book called The Hard Tomorrow by Eleanor Davis. You may not have heard of her. She's extremely versatile. And I consider her to be one of the very best cartoonists in the world. She writes and draws all of her own material. And they usually are science fiction tinged. Hard Tomorrow was released in late 2019. And it tells of like a slightly futuristic world, just a few years in the future, where Mark Zuckerberg is president of the United States, and he's like a horrible tyrant. And the book revolves around this couple, a man and woman, and she really wants to have a baby in the face of there's mass protests throughout the United States that are being viciously stomped down by stormtrooper presence, and it kind of follows her and her group of protester friends and her her kind of weighing the balance of is this a moral act to bring a child into the world? And reading it then was wow, that's, because she was weighing these things in the wake of, her view of the society we live in. And a year later, it's become it's kind of terrifying. And she draws in this, she's a really clever use of color and this kind of slightly grotesque, distorted style of art. And it's emotionally very powerful, and also very entertaining and very open-ended. But she never draws the same thing twice. And that's why I find her interesting, because she did this one surreal book called Why Art, which involves works of art coming to life and trying to destroy people. She did one called You and a Bike on a Road, which is an autobiographical book about her deciding to bike from Arizona to Georgia. Mm-hmm. And her progress and the things that she saw along the way. She's done kids' books.
Yeah, but the one you're recommending is definitely not a kid's book.
Oh, for sure not.
You said her name was Eleanor.
Eleanor Davis from
Okay,
Yeah,
uh,
it comes right up. As he was
I'll check
talking
her
about it,
out.
The Hard Tomorrow. We've actually seen her artwork before, Albert. I'm just not sure exactly where, but it looks very familiar.
she's is she from Athens originally? I think she may be. I think she and her husband live in Savannah.
Okay. And so that'd be your recommendation out there, just something different to read, something to go for that's not the classical, typical comic book.
It's good. It's very readable. Um, and like I said, the art is, for a superhero fan, the art's going to look a little odd. But
Oh, yeah.
she's very skilled.
Yeah, but the nice thing, it's back when I was getting into comic books, we had, of course, it was John Byrne, the go-to guy, the X-Men, Superman, Fantastic Four, George Perez. They all came from that Neil Adams school.
Right. Hyper realism.
Exactly. And but then you also had Sienkiewicz on the New Mutants. And as I grew up, as I grew into my later teen years, because of this different exposures, these different artists on superhero comics that shouldn't necessarily be there, or you wouldn't think would be there, your taste broaden. You learn to accept a lot reading in this format.
Well, I'll tell you what. I mean, I grew up on a steady diet of Byrne and Perez.
Yeah.
And Perez is still absolutely my guy.
Oh yeah.
There's a little anecdote I like to share, because I like clear line minimalist cartooning a lot, except when I don't. And Perez is kind of like the opposite of that. And he was on a panel, and he took the old, what someone like John Buscema, for example, who's love John Buscema, but he was really what you would describe as he was a hack, like almost self-described, of like, comics drawing is a job, and the best way to do this job is as quickly and efficiently as possible with as few lines as you can, like just get through it. And it's funny because, I mean, John Buscema hated superhero comics. He hated drawing them, but it was his job. He liked drawing Conan. That's about it. But the superhero stuff, not interested. And Perez said, it's like, Buscema would say, don't use 3 lines when you can use 1. And I was on a panel with Perez, and Perez talked about how much he loved filling up every panel. And he said, why use 3 lines when you can use 10?
Well, this is the man that blew his hand out on doing that one cover for JLA Avengers. I mean, really, and I hate that we don't get to see as much from him anymore.
Yeah, and so where I was going with that was, I was raised absolutely a steady diet of that kind of comics realism. And so when I was a little kid and I would read Kirby and Ditko reprints, it was like, this doesn't look right, until I got a little bit older and sort of understood what they were doing and how things can be different. Because, I mean, Ditko is as far away from anything resembling modern superhero cartooning as you can possibly think of. But I mean, he was the guy for a long time for that in Doctor Strange, and he invented their visual vocabularies. And then Kirby was, invented a dynamic motion in comics, and was the best at it, even if his figures were meant not to look real. They were meant to look, every character is meant to look a little godlike, a little, and Ditko is the opposite. He liked his characters to look ugly. He wanted them to look like everyday people.
And you've heard the story, of course, of Stan going back and forth over Spider-Man between Kirby and Ditko, and telling Kirby he's not muscle up. He's just a kid. He's just a kid. And Kirby had him all muscled up. And of course, Ditko was the one that got it. And just drew him like a normal person. Yeah.
And both of them drew motion in their own ways that, going back and looking at it, you're realizing are ingenious. And I think that's an important attitude to take with regard to comics in general. And that kind of leads me sort of like an overall evaluation of the independent scene. Comics is a very interesting place because when I was young, it was dying as a format. And in the mid 90s, companies were going bankrupt and there was no market and there was no bookstore market that existed at that time. And it was harder to get comics in the hands of kids.
When after the mid '90s, it was almost impossible for me to find comic books because all the grocery stores and drugstores, that was once it went under, that was it.
Exactly.
There was one baseball card shop a couple of towns over from me that would have stuff a few months after it came out. If I was lucky to find like I discovered Astro CD through them because that's like for some reason they held. I think one of the people that owned it liked that book, so they held it.
Sure,
absolutely. I had to drive like 40 minutes to find anywhere.
And you make a really good point. It's like if you didn't live in a big city that had comic shops and you live in a smaller town, and it's like, yeah, you had no good way of getting to it. And then a few things changed. One of them was the introduction of manga to U.S. markets, which was important because it started to bring girls back into reading comics again. And then around 2000, the rise of the bookstore market, what started with certain literary comics by people like Chris Ware and Dan Clowes, but soon started to get bigger and bigger. And then Fantagraphics, the key thing that happened in that company, because they were always on the verge of going under, was they got the license to reprint Peanuts from Charles Schultz's widow, which was a license basically to print money.
Sitting on the shelf behind me, yeah.
Right. It's like no one had ever reprinted them from beginning to end. It was always in like, what it was like as a kid if you read Peanuts.
Snoopy had a book.
Yeah, it's like you had a paperback, a cheap paperback that said, you're dumb and stupid.
Because all newspaper strips had those same books. It was like,
right,
like this thick.
Valentine's.
Maybe magazine size roughly, and it was just, here's some stuff.
Or some of them were actually
theme-based.
From the 50s and 60s, they were like little paperbacks.
Yeah, they were usually they were theme-based based on like, well, here's all of a certain character, here's all of a certain thing, and that's how it went.
And for them, it was always frustrating because it would be called, you're a dumb loser, Charlie Brown. And inside it would say, selections from, Snoopy is the best. So that you knew that there's some other book that had these cartoons in it, maybe more of them. And it just drive me crazy because Schultz did a lot more continuity work than people tend to remember.
Oh, God, yeah. The whole Charlie Brown, it was Sherman and Patty and Violet in the beginning.
Right.
And yeah, and Charlie Brown was the youngest of, there's this whole story.
And he would tell sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes like for some of the summer camp stories, like a month of an entire thing. And Schultz was like, some of these strips aren't that good. I don't want to reprint them. They're just not strong enough. He was like, who wants to look at those? And not thinking that like people would want to read these books in order from the beginning and be interested in them.
Well,
that financed a bunch of stuff for Fantagraphics.
Did they put out the big Popeye books?
They did.
I have several of those. Those are really great too.
Those are amazing.
Yeah. Those are fantastic.
So interesting. So Fantagraphics had a little money, and these reprint books. So when Peanuts became successful, other companies started looking around to reprint classic strips. And then over the next decade, you had not just bookstores, but as you know, and as I like to say, a lot of people, the most unsung hero in saving and nurturing comics today are libraries. And libraries and comics have a beautiful relationship together because comics need outlets for people to read them. If you don't have, especially if you don't have a store, it's libraries buying those comics and then, helping create demand is great for comics. But conversely, comics are great for libraries because for a lot of comics, people are hungry for these comics and maybe they can't afford them. Maybe you can't afford a $20 hardcover or a $30 hardcover. And it gives them a place to not only go and like use the services of this library, but smart libraries do things like host comics festivals and host workshops and bring people in, like 24-hour comics day, things like that. So it's this beautiful, this beautiful relationship where both are getting things out of it. But the thing that's most important, especially if it's kids, you're creating this generation of people, these kids, for whom not only are comics a daily part of their lives, but more and more, as more and more things become available, manga, superhero comics, young adult comics, kid comics, literary comics. When you're a kid and a young adult and you're reading all of that, suddenly there's no distinction. It's just comics. So like more and more young cartoonists, they might be independent and they might do alternative and weird comics, but you can see, oh, they've clearly read a lot of manga, or they've clearly read a lot of science fiction, or they've clearly read Spider-Man and read them all at once. And it's creating these new weird things that are like hard to categorize. It's like genre elements, but it's not genre in the traditional way like we think of with a superhero comic.
Not genre specific, just like you said, a combination of all these.
It's a blend. Yeah. And like you say, a lot of these comics are a lot more, they have genre elements, but they're far more humane. And they're far more interested in character and psychological elements. And then as a result, you have all these kids who are growing up like, I love reading this and I want to write them and I want to draw them. So like when they go to the library and there's a workshop, it's like the first time it's like someone saying, here's how you do it. And then they think about, and then some kids stop doing it and that's fine. Other ones are like, no, I want more. And a lot of those kids are going to these art schools that have some of which are comics specific, comics only. And so, there are more interesting cartoonists alive right now than the history of the entire world. And many of them are under 25 years old. So it's exciting. The only unfortunate thing is that there's not enough money to go around, pay all of them just yet.
Well, that's it. You're.
But it is easier. I mean, in this day and age, it's a lot easier for someone, to make their own thing and just sort of put it out there and directly, as far as the money aspect of it, direct like Patreons and stuff like that, or Kickstarters, that where you don't have to go through a big publisher or anything. You just got to know how to, work at social media and all that stuff. And if you got something good, there's always an audience for something good. You just got to find it.
And you're right. There are fewer barriers for people seeing your comics, especially now, than ever. And it's great, especially for the one thing I like to tell young creators is it's important to get better in public. And for young people going to art school, or comic school, I say, I know you've got this 500-page graphic novel that you cannot wait to write. Don't do it just yet. Write something short and finish it, publish it. Write a mini comic, write a web comic, put it out there, and then advertise it, let people see it. And I say, and there's one big reason is that if you're drawing your graphic novel, it's 500 pages. It takes you 2 years to write, and you're still kind of learning what you're doing. By the time it's over, page 1 is going to look real different from page 500.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're going to see it, and you're going to hate yourself.
Yeah.
And you're going to want to redraw the entire thing, and that is just madness. So that's like my big piece of advice to young artists.
Rob, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much. And again, tell everybody again where they can find you.
Sure. HiLoComics.blogspot.com, believe it or not, and soulrad.co are my 2 big places. Oh, and I have a Patreon. Hilo Comics, I think it is, or Rob Clow. It's just, if you do Patreon plus Rob Clow, you'll find it. I publish stuff there. And if you're interested in seeing my takes on pop culture in general, I'm a frequent contributor to Looper.com. I'm actually writing about Sandman, believe it or not, for them right now.
Awesome. Albert, you hear that? He's writing about Sandman.
I'll see.
Albert has a contentious relationship with Mr. Gaiman.
Well,
Gaiman.
me too.
Really? Do you?
I mean, sure. I mean, and rereading that series is so interesting because there are parts of it where it's like, wow, he really thinks he's super cutting edge here, and it's just kind of embarrassing to read now.
Yeah,
and there are other parts of it that are like, this is still really clever.
Yeah.
There's some of it like you can go through and read, you're like, wow, this is some of the best comics I've ever read. Then some of it you're like, good Lord, what am I reading? You know, like it's because Sandman was just like Gaiman used it to put everything. Like whatever idea or anything he had back then was like, oh, we'll just make it part of Sandman. So
Well, let's try to gauge.
Some of it worked and some of it didn't.
Let's try to gauge this for my sake real quick. Rob, where do you stand on the Dream of a Thousand Cats?
It's a little precious, like a lot of his work. It's fine. It's more interesting are the 2 Shakespeare ones he did.
Yeah.
Those are actually clever and thematically interesting.
Yeah. I just thought in as much something that didn't necessarily come back to play in the end, in the final chapter of Sandman, I just thought that was a nice little standalone with the cats.
It's fine.
Yeah.
It's perfectly innocuous.
And Albert, where do you stand on it?
Oh. Well, see, the standalone stuff in Sandman's some of my favorite stuff in it. You know, it's just little bite-sized things. Like, and the overall thing with Dream and Morpheus was great. And then, like, especially that last chunk of that book, I just don't like. So,
I'll tell you what, Kindly Ones went on forever. And you have to remember, I was reading it monthly.
I was too.
And I was just like, good Lord, let's just get on with it. And also, I'm not a fan of Mark Hempel's art. And I was baffled at Gaiman's choice of Mark Hempel for like a 15-part arc.
Yeah, that kind of wore on me.
So it's like, sure, a single issue thing with Mark Hempel's style, fine. But 15 issues of this, like, again, super precious style of art, hyper stylized and cartoony was just like,
for what this was supposed to be.
Like, no.
I agree. Rob, once again, it's been awesome having you here. We want to have you back, and give me about a month or so, and we'll work out something and have you on Kingdom Casts, if you're good with that.
Sounds
good. Next year, we're going to recommend you come on some more panels and all.
My pleasure. Yeah.
And I want to take this opportunity to give a shout out to David Wright. Thank you. So,
thanks, Dave.
Once again, I'm Stan Daniel. That's Albert Marsh. We're on Kingdom Casts podcast, and this has been the independent and, well, more than just the independent comic panel, but We appreciate the Hoover Library Sci-Fi Fantasy Fest having us do this. Thank you again so much, guys, and I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Hope you enjoyed.
Oh,
You see.
God, yes, more than. Let's
All right.
see here.
Take
Hold
care.
on a second.